Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism with Penny Colpin. In this segment, I want to talk about I think they're common sense kind of things, but I just want to have it as a reminder of how to find potentially helpful resources for either your own journey or if you know somebody who's really struggling and finding finding it challenging working in the mental health system. There's a lot of variability, and finding a good match is actually very important. That actually ties in with statistics and something called combinatorics that I'll actually talk about in another time, but it goes to the idea of finding a good match. There are people who the biomedical model, the dominant model of things are all not just related to biochemical, but things are due to biochemical imbalances in the brain. That works for some people, works for a percentage of people, especially when you put that over a population of hundreds of millions of people like we have in the United States. There is a percentage of people who are helped by that. There are many more who are not. And so it comes down to, how do you help someone find resources that resonate with them? Now, for me, I didn't come across much of that material until probably the last 5 or 6 years ago. I came across a few items in the first few years after the breakdown, and then I focused on healing and recovering. But then as I got to looking into it back in about 2019, 2020, I was going through kind of a second awakening process. And there were so many resources that were from the 1960s and 1970s and even the early 80s, well over a decade before my own experience in 98, that you just don't hear a lot of these days. And that was so frustrating. I mean, there was a period of several months where I'd call a friend of mine after having come across yet another resource that would have been helpful, saying it's so hard to not be angry about this. I mean, and these are resources who were psychiatrists, medical doctors, doing work in consciousness, which is what I ended up dealing with, is non-ordinary states of consciousness. So this segment, I just want to remind some people of how to consume material and how to find additional resources. So one of the things is first, coming across something that even resonates with you. And if you're watching this channel, there's a fairly decent chance that some of the people I've mentioned might at least be a starting point for you. Darn, I just knocked something off my desk. Oh, well. So as you consume material, I recommend keeping a little notebook, making some key notes. If you're reading a 200-page book, you're not going to remember everything. I mean, I know I don't. And in fact, I've gotten to the point where I treat some of these books almost like textbooks, that I actually buy them and then I go through and highlight, and I put little napkin pieces in there. By the end, I have like 40, 50, 60 of them in there. But so that I can go back through and try and find some of the highlights and key pieces. But as you're reading, also note other people who are mentioned. And of course, footnotes, the bibliography, the people who write the intros, the forewords, recommendations, that type of thing. Those are all people that you can consider and see what their work is and how does it overlap. If you're watching some kind of documentary, there are some really good ones out there. I had the opportunity to interview Phil Borges in Crazy Wise. That's a good one. The Wisdom of Trauma is another good one. Medicating Normal is a good one. They don't all deal with the same things, but they do deal with kind of this trauma as having some value and learning how to grow beyond that trauma and heal it and not just treat it with chemicals. So if you're watching a documentary, watch it a couple times. There were times with Crazy Wise, I actually watched and then stopped and made the notes of who are the people in here so that then I could take it online and look them up and see what kind of material they might have. So for example, with Crazy Wise, Robert Whitaker was in there. And surprise, surprise, Robert Whitaker, who wrote Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic, and then has the Mad in America webzine, Phil Borges wrote an article about crazy lies. So if you go to the madinamerica.com website and search on Phil Borges, guess what? He has an article there. So there's kind of a cross-pollination thing with a number of people who are looking at some of these mental crises as they relate to trauma and stored trauma, and how trauma can erupt or collapse the ego, dealing with non-ordinary states of consciousness, understanding a framework and the context for why someone might be suffering, that type of thing. So that's something to consider, is looking at a piece of work and look at the reference notes. Who are some of the other authors they reference? And sometimes it goes back 100 years or more. You know, you hear about William James quite a bit. Yeah, and the mystical side, you can go back 2 millennia dealing with some of these lamas and gurus and that type of thing. And that's when you're like, boy, you know, they'll insert a small piece from something, go, yeah, that's only 1,000 years old, that concept, that would have helped. So yeah, again, when you come across it, it's liberating and it's helpful, but it can also be very frustrating. One thing I want to mention is that I've already mentioned several people just in the few videos that I've made. I'm lucky in that I can go out and buy books. I look for used books. I use library book sales sometimes. I like to check the little free library boxes where you can leave a book or take a book. I use bookstores, that type of thing. And largely because so much of the material I find helpful is fairly old. I mean, it's 40, 50 years old. So sometimes I can come across the original version of those books for just a few bucks. I recognize that a number of people going through mental crises, and especially if it's gone for a long period of time, a lot of folks end up financially depleted, financially challenged, that you can't just go out and buy a ton of new books. So, and even if you can, use your library as well. You know, take a look and find out, does this resonate? And then you might say, yeah, I actually want it as part of my library because I want to be able to reread it again, or I want to be able to make notes in it or whatever. So I strongly recommend using your library, using some other sources, as opposed to just going out and buying things new. And in fact, I think it was 1997, it was a year or two before the breakdown, I actually was working with a counselor for a few months, and she kept recommending that I read a certain book, that, you know, we'd be talking about something and, oh, that reminds me of this book. And what I should have done was said, well, what chapter, what page, show me in the book what resonates. And instead I went out and bought the book. I mean, over the span of a few months, I bought like 20 books, and guess what? They didn't resonate to me in the same way as they did to her. So I can share what helped me, but that may or may not help you. And so I don't want to encourage people to just go buy a bunch of things, and because I recognize what it's like to, hate to use the word, but almost be desperate, you know, trying to find something that helps. So keep in mind some of these other tools, especially a library, or you might ask your friends, do they have that book or whatever? Let's see. So some of the resources that I've mentioned so far in the, as I mentioned in the last video, I'm rebooting this and trying to get this organized better, figuring out how to kind of maybe group topics together for a series and then try a different series after 8 or 10 sessions. So some of the resources I found helpful, and I mentioned these in my book, Musings from a Consecrated Mind. I've mentioned Carl Jung quite a bit. I've mentioned him in videos, the concepts of synchronicity, individuation. He was the one who coined the shadow Freud is the id. I didn't learn as much about Freud as I did about Jung. Collective unconscious, that type of thing. Stanislav and Christina Grof, I can't remember, I came across their work in probably about 2019, 2020. The concept of non-ordinary states of consciousness, the spiritual emergence, spiritual emergency. Initially, when I heard those terms, I had heard before that the concept of spiritual awakening, which resonated with me. I was like, I don't want to have had a spiritual emergency. That's not as cool as spiritual awakening. But over time, it's like, yeah, okay, I had a rough time of it. You know, people can go through spiritual awakenings without running into some of the difficulties that I did. And so in time, I was like, no, they're on it. They might use different language than I initially used, but they have a bit of a value as well. A couple of the books, let's see, oh, did I set them aside? Was The Stormy Search to the Self, that, does it say? It lists them both as the authors, but actually what it is it's a collection of essays from different people. If I remember right, Ram Dass had something in here. That's another way of looking at books, is you might have a book that is written by the author entirely, or it might be a collection of pieces. Here's another one that involved Stanislav Grof, edited by him, but it lists people like Marie-Louise von Franz. I haven't done a whole lot with her. Jack Kornfield, I've heard his stuff. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, John Weir Perry. His name's come up in a few things. So this is more of a collection. And again, this is a resource that kind of exposes you to other people's works. And then from there, you can go and find additional material that might be helpful. And so there's a bit of kind of cross pollination, if you will, between people whose works overlap. Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, that was back in the 1950s when he came up with that, Myths We Live By. I think that had a copyright of in the early 70s. If I remember right, I think he wrote the foreword to one of Jung's collected works. So again, there's a relationship. I mentioned Robert Whitaker, had a chance to interview him a couple years ago. Surprise, surprise, as I mentioned, Phil Borges has an article, Will Hall, who I also interviewed, Bruce Levine, Jim Gottstein. They've all been involved with Mad in America. So again, you can find specific people whose works resonate with you. And crazy-wise, surprise, surprise, Robert Whitaker was in there, Gabor Mate, who's very involved with trauma work, Stanislav Grof was interviewed, and Will Hall. So again, there's this similar group. I mentioned John Weir Perry in one of the Joseph Campbell books, Myths We Live By. He has a chapter on schizophrenia, which, keep in mind, in the early 70s, bipolar didn't yet exist. It hadn't been named that yet. And so who was it? Oh, the folks at Esalen had asked Joseph Campbell to come and speak on schizophrenia. He's like, what do I know about schizophrenia? I shouldn't laugh. But he was like, I'm not comfortable. I can talk about myth because that's what he studied, but I'm not comfortable relating that to schizophrenia. And so they actually contacted John Weir Perry, and the two of them apparently gave a presentation, because at the start of that chapter, it mentions John Weir Perry, who did specialize in schizophrenia. In fact, I just reread this book, The Far Side of Madness, which I highly recommend. It's very interesting. And for a lot of people who get diagnosed with bipolar, in some ways that's kind of, there's a lot of variability. And not just in the experiences, even how people get diagnosed based on what the practitioner believes. You know, there's a lot of misdiagnosis going on. And so in some ways, bipolar, if it has the so-called psychotic features, and again, I don't care much for that terminology. It just means a split from reality. Well, Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. So whatever. But if you have this kind of split type behavior that if you're reading older material from the 1970s, you're probably going to run into terms related to schizophrenia. And you can tell, though, by the way the author uses those terms, whether or not they have respect for the experience. And I'll tell you, John Ware Perry did. I read this a few years ago, and boy, when I reread it, I was like, whoa, that was worth rereading. So again, there's an overlap. And in fact, even just today, I had read this book, The Tao of Psychology by Jean Shinoda Bolen, MD. That came out in like 1979 or 82 or something like that. And I had forgotten, she mentions in one of the first chapters that her supervisor, when she was taking the psychiatric, I don't know if it's an internship or guidance or whatever, but John Perry was her supervisor. So again, there's those relationships through some of that material. And you can tell a lot of the stuff I look at is from 40 and 50 years ago. That doesn't mean there isn't good work being done now. But for me, that's the stuff from 40 and 50 years ago was fabulous. And so I want to help resurrect some of that material and give credit where it's due for the working consciousness that was going on in the 60s, even going back to the 40s and 50s. So like I say, I just wanted to kind of refresh some ideas here that though I'll be referencing a number of works and quite a bit of material, I don't want people to have a sense of going broke just because I'm able to reference a number of different pieces of work. So please, please be judicious in what you purchase and how you purchase and how you consume material. One thing that goes back to before my mom passed, in fact, I think it was even before I was born, she had Rosicrucians came to door to door. I mean, this was back in the 60s, and they gave her some material to read, and she was okay with it. And right at the start of this one book, it said, just because you're reading this, I'm paraphrasing, but just because you're reading this doesn't make it any more or less true. And for her, that freed things up, that she didn't have to be fearful of reading something, and she didn't have to judge whether or not it was right or wrong. But I would recommend you can look at this and say, is this helpful to me or is it not? And if it's not, then recognize, hey, it might help other people. It's just not helpful to you. And I hope you can find references and resources that are helpful to you or a loved one who might be going through a mental crisis. So take a look at those footnotes. And actually, I grabbed my copy of Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I'm pretty sure I teased him about it when I interviewed him. But this thing has like 700 reference notes in it. And even this, there's another small book I was looking at, Jung's Psychology in Tibetan Buddhism. 100 pages, has 200 footnotes. And so even just scanning through the footnotes, you can have a feel for some other pieces of work. And of course, the gal with the Jung Psychology, she references a number of Jung's works that I haven't read yet and am not that familiar with. And in fact, I may not read the whole thing, but at least become familiar with some of those works. So I hope that is a good reminder to some people to don't just read a book and don't just watch a documentary, but take the next step and maybe study it a little bit or make some key notes from it so that you can then expand and find tools that are helpful to you. So again, thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great rest of your day.